There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary. They were the camouflage of routine, the quiet uniform of a Tuesday night, and they slip past your defenses without a sound. You don't realize their true nature until much later, when you look back and see the fine, hairline crack they left in the foundation of your world. For me, that moment wasn't a grand explosion or a dramatic revelation. It was the simple, undeniable weight of Alex's head in my lap, the soft rhythm of his breathing, a quiet metronome counting down to a future I had never allowed myself to imagine. It was a stillness so profound it felt like a shout, a silence that contained every word we had ever been afraid to say to each other. In that dim living room, with the blue light of a muted television painting shadows on the walls, I understood that the careful architecture of our friendship was about to be tested, and I wasn't sure if it was strong enough to withstand the truth. The truth, as I knew it then, was a secret I had curated with the same meticulous patience I applied to my work in the darkroom. It was a living thing, breathing in the quiet spaces of my life, fed by small, stolen glances and the lingering warmth of an accidental touch. I had kept it sheltered from the light for 6 years, ever since Alex had first crashed into my life like a rogue wave, all bright energy and effortless charm, threatening to pull my carefully constructed solitude out to sea. We met in a sophomore literature seminar, a class neither of us should have been in. I was there because it fulfilled a humanities credit I'd been putting off, hiding in the back corner with my sketchbook, treating the lecture hall as just another space to observe the human condition from a safe distance. He was there, I later learned, because he'd lost a bet with a teammate on the university swim team, and the forfeit was to take the most unjock-like class on the registrar's list. He sat in the front row, a shock of sun-bleached blonde hair falling over his forehead, his broad shoulders straining the fabric of his university-branded polo shirt. He looked as out of place as a bonfire in a library, and yet, he seemed completely unbothered by it. I watched him the way I watched everything, with a photographer's eye for detail. I noticed the way he tapped his pen against his notebook in a restless, syncopated rhythm, the way he'd run a hand through his hair when the professor discussed metaphysical poetry, a look of genuine, baffled concentration on his face. He was an object of anthropological fascination to me, a representative of a world I only ever documented from the periphery. The world of easy laughter, casual confidence, and an uncomplicated relationship with one's own body. He moved with a swimmer's grace, a fluid economy of motion that suggested a deep, instinctual comfort in his own skin that I, with my lanky frame and perpetually awkward limbs, could only envy. I filled pages of my sketchbook with quick, charcoal studies of him. The line of his jaw, the curve of his neck, the way the light caught in his hair. They were just exercises in form and shadow, I told myself. Nothing more. Our worlds collided over John Donne. We were assigned a partner project, a presentation on the Holy Sonnets, and when the professor called out our names together, I felt a jolt of something I could only describe as pure, distilled panic. Alex turned in his seat, his eyes scanning the lecture hall until they landed on me. He offered a small, disarming smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, which held a look of shared, comical dread. "Leo, right?" he asked, making his way up the tiered steps to my secluded corner. "Looks like we're in this together." I remember the scent of chlorine that clung to him, a clean, chemical smell that was so intrinsically a part of his identity. It was the smell of disciplined exertion, of countless hours spent chasing a black line on the bottom of a pool. It was the smell of his world, not mine. I expected him to be a terrible partner. I had mentally prepared myself to do all the work, to accept his charmingly apologetic excuses and deliver the presentation myself. But Alex surprised me. He was not a natural academic, that much was clear. The dense, tortured language of 17th century poetry was as foreign to him as the surface of Mars. Yet, he was determined. He showed up to our library sessions on time, his textbook filled with fluorescent highlights and confused-looking question marks in the margins. He listened, truly listened, as I tried to unravel the intricate knots of paradox and faith in Donne's verses. He asked questions that were surprisingly insightful, not about literary theory, but about the human emotion behind the words. So, this guy is basically terrified of God, but also desperate for him to notice? He'd ask, leaning forward, his chin resting in his hand. That's a lot. It was this earnest, unpretentious curiosity that first began to dismantle my preconceptions. He wasn't just a jock. He was a person trying to make sense of a world that was far more complex than the clear, chlorinated lanes of a swimming pool. Our friendship was built in those hushed, dusty corners of the campus library. It was built on lukewarm coffee from a vending machine and shared anxieties about iambic pentameter. I found myself talking more than I usually did, explaining the concepts of metaphysical conceits and divine love, and in return, he would tell me about the grueling monotony of his training schedule, the immense pressure of competing at a national level. He spoke of the water as a place of both sanctuary and torment, a silent world where the only thing that mattered was the burn in his muscles and the rhythm of his own heartbeat. I realized we were both fluent in the language of solitude, though we practiced it in vastly different arenas. My solitude was in the quiet click of a camera shutter, in the patient alchemy of the darkroom. His was in the submerged silence of the pool, in the lonely pursuit of shaving milliseconds off a personal best. We were two sides of the same coin, and the discovery of this shared core felt like finding an unexpected point of common ground in a vast, alien landscape. After the semester ended, we kept in touch. It was Alex who initiated it, texting me to see a movie or grabbing me on my way out of the dining hall. It felt strange at first, this effortless inclusion in his orbit. His friends, a boisterous crew of athletes, regarded me with a sort of benign confusion, like a stray cat their friend had inexplicably decided to adopt. But Alex was the gravitational center of his social circle, and his acceptance of me was all that was needed. I became a quiet fixture in their group, the guy with the camera, the observer on the edge of the frame. I documented their victories and their parties, my camera granting me a passport into a world I never would have entered on my own. And through it all, my friendship with Alex deepened, settling into a comfortable, easy rhythm. The moment I knew my feelings had irrevocably shifted was a quiet one, almost unnoticeable. It was the spring of our senior year. Alex had just suffered a devastating loss at the NCAA championships, missing his chance to qualify for the Olympic trials by a fraction of a second. He had been projected to win. The campus newspaper had run a full-page story on him, hailing him as the university's next great hope. The failure was public and profound. He disappeared for 2 days. He didn't answer texts or calls from his teammates, his coach, or his then-girlfriend, a bubbly cheerleader named Jessica. On the third night, there was a soft knock on my dorm room door. I opened it to find him standing there, looking smaller than I had ever seen him. His hair was damp, and he was wearing a threadbare sweatshirt and sweatpants. His eyes were red-rimmed and hollow. He didn't say anything. He just looked at me, a silent question hanging in the air. I stepped aside, and he walked in, sinking onto the edge of my narrow dorm bed. I closed the door and sat at my desk, giving him space, letting the silence stretch. I didn't ask him what was wrong or where he had been. I didn't offer platitudes or easy reassurances. I just sat with him in the quiet dark, the only light coming from the glow of my computer monitor. After what felt like an hour, he finally spoke, his voice rough. I feel like I'm drowning. It was a shocking confession from a man who had spent most of his life mastering the water, making it his kingdom. The irony was brutal. I turned in my chair to face him. He was staring at his hands, his long fingers laced together. "It's okay to feel that way," I said, my own voice barely a whisper. He looked up then, and his eyes were filled with a raw, unguarded vulnerability that I had never seen before. He had always been the sun, radiating warmth and confidence. But in that moment, all I saw was a profound and terrifying darkness. A dam inside him seemed to break, and he started talking. He told me about the weight of expectation, the years of sacrifice, the singular focus that had consumed his entire life. He talked about the crushing silence of the water rushing past his ears as he saw the other swimmer touch the wall just before him. He confessed that he didn't know who he was without swimming. The identity that had defined him, that had been the bedrock of his existence, had crumbled in the space of 487 seconds. I listened. I didn't offer advice. I just let him pour all of it out into the safe, quiet space of my room. When he finally fell silent, exhausted and emotionally spent, there were tears tracking through the stubble on his cheeks. And in that moment, watching him break and then slowly, tentatively begin to reassemble himself, I felt something shift deep within me. It wasn't pity. It was a profound, aching tenderness. It was the fierce, protective urge to shield him from a world that had demanded so much of him and then discarded him so casually. It was the quiet, terrifying realization that the carefully drawn boundary between friendship and something more had dissolved without my consent. I loved him. It wasn't a choice. It was a fact, as solid and irrefutable as the floor beneath my feet. I buried that fact. I packed it away in a lead-lined box and sunk it to the bottom of my consciousness. He had a girlfriend. He was my friend. He was, by all accounts, completely and unshakably straight. To confess my feelings would be an act of social and emotional sabotage. It would detonate the most important relationship in my life, leaving nothing but smoking wreckage. So I became a master of emotional containment. I learned to live with the low, constant hum of my affection, to treat it as a kind of chronic but manageable condition. After graduation, we decided to get an apartment together. It seemed like the most natural thing in the world. For him, it was a matter of convenience and comfort. For me, it was a form of self-inflicted torture, a daily exercise in loving someone from a distance of only a few feet. I photographed cityscapes, portraits, the quiet poetry of forgotten things. My life was about capturing moments, but the most significant moments of my own life were the ones I could never capture, the ones that existed only in the unseen space between us. And then came Sarah. She was different from his other girlfriends. She was a software engineer, sharp and witty and ambitious. She met Alex on his own intellectual level in a way the others hadn't. For a while, I thought he had finally found his match. They were good together. They laughed at the same stupid jokes. They challenged each other. They looked like the perfect, glossy magazine couple. I learned to tolerate the sight of her shoes by the front door, the sound of her laughter echoing from his bedroom. I became an expert at making myself scarce, at fading into the background of their life together. I told myself I was happy for him, and in a way I was. Seeing him happy was a balm, even if I wasn't the source of that happiness. But there was always a quiet, selfish part of me that felt a pang of something cold and sharp whenever I saw him look at her with an unguarded affection I so desperately craved for myself. The shift began, as so many shifts do, not with a bang, but with a slow, creeping silence. Alex and Sarah had been together for almost 2 years when the cracks started to appear. The easy laughter that used to fill our apartment became infrequent, replaced by a tense, brittle quiet. I would come home to find them sitting on opposite ends of the couch, the space between them charged with unspoken grievances. Alex started working later. He picked up new consulting projects that required him to travel. He was running, I realized, not towards something new, but away from the slow, painful unraveling of his relationship. He became withdrawn, a ghost haunting the edges of his own life. The bright, solar energy that had always defined him seemed to dim, the light in his eyes flickering like a faulty bulb. The end came on a rainy Thursday in November. I came home from a shoot to find a cardboard box on the kitchen counter, filled with Sarah's things, a coffee mug, a framed photo of the two of them hiking, a well-worn copy of her favorite novel. Alex was sitting on the couch, staring at the rain-streaked window, his hands limp at his sides. The apartment was unnervingly quiet. He didn't turn when I came in. "She's gone," he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. I didn't know what to say. I just stood there, my camera bag digging into my shoulder, an awkward, silent witness to the end of an era. I had imagined this moment so many times, and in my most selfish fantasies, it was a moment of release, of opportunity. But the reality was just sad and empty. The man on the couch was my best friend, and he was hurting. Any flicker of hope I might have felt was instantly extinguished by a wave of empathy for his pain. "I'm sorry, Alex," I said, the words feeling hopelessly inadequate. He just nodded, his gaze still fixed on the window. "It was mutual," he said, as if trying to convince himself. "We just wanted different things. She wanted to talk about marriage, about moving to the suburbs. I just couldn't. Every time she brought it up, I felt like the walls were closing in." He finally turned to look at me, and his eyes were filled with a familiar, terrifying confusion, the same confusion I had seen that night in my dorm room years ago. "What's wrong with me, Leo? Why can't I just be happy with that? It's what everyone wants, right?" That question hung in the air between us, heavy and unanswered. He was lonely. I had seen him lonely before, but this was different. This was a deeper, more existential loneliness, the kind that came from realizing you might not be the person you always thought you were. In the weeks that followed, he retreated even further into himself. He stopped going out with his friends. He worked from home more often, spending his days cloistered in his room, the sound of his fingers flying across his keyboard the only sign of life. But at night, he would emerge, drawn to the light and ambient noise of the living room where I would be editing photos or reading. He wouldn't talk much. He would just sink into the other end of the couch, a silent, brooding presence, and we would coexist in a shared, comfortable quiet. The ritual began subtly. It started with him falling asleep during a movie. I'd look over and find him slumped against the cushions, his face relaxed in a way it never was when he was awake, the lines of stress around his eyes and mouth smoothed away. I'd drape a blanket over him and turn off the lights, leaving him there rather than waking him. It felt like the right thing to do, a small act of care. Then, one night, after a particularly grueling week of work, he didn't even pretend to watch the movie. He just came out of his room with a pillow and a blanket and lay down on the couch. "Do you mind?" he asked, his voice muffled by the pillow. "My room feels too quiet tonight. Too empty." My heart did a painful little flip in my chest. "No," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I don't mind." That was the first time. It became a pattern. His bedroom, once the inner sanctum of his life with Sarah, became a space he actively avoided. The couch became his sanctuary. And because I was always on the couch, I became part of that sanctuary, a silent guardian against the loneliness that haunted the other rooms of our apartment. At first, there was a careful, almost formal distance between us. He would take one end of the large sectional, and I would take the other. We were two separate islands in a sea of upholstery. But slowly, imperceptibly, the geography began to shift. The empty space between us began to shrink. It started with a shared blanket on a cold night. Then he started using one of the throw pillows, which he would inevitably push closer and closer to my side of the couch as he drifted off to sleep. I became acutely, painfully aware of his proximity. I could feel the heat radiating from his body, smell the faint, clean scent of his soap. My senses were on high alert, cataloging every detail, every subtle shift. My internal monologue became a relentless, looping analysis of his behavior. What did this mean? Was this just what friends did? Was he so starved for simple, non-sexual human contact that he was turning to me to fill that void? Or was it something more? I was terrified of misinterpreting his actions, of seeing what I wanted to see instead of what was actually there. The ambiguity was a form of exquisite torture. I spent my days trying to maintain a semblance of normalcy, focusing on my work, meeting deadlines, pretending that our nights were not charged with a silent, growing tension. My photography became a refuge. Through the lens of my camera, I could impose order on a chaotic world. I could frame a moment, control the light, find the beauty in the mundane. But I couldn't frame what was happening on my couch. I couldn't control the light and shadow in Alex's heart. I was just a spectator, watching a story unfold, terrified of my own role in it. The first time he touched me, it felt like an electric shock. He had been asleep for about an hour, his breathing deep and even. I was reading, the small pool of light from my lamp illuminating the pages of my book. In his sleep, he shifted, rolling onto his side to face me. He mumbled something incoherent, and then his arm flopped out, his hand landing on my thigh. It was a dead weight, heavy and warm. My entire body went rigid. I stopped breathing. I stared down at his hand, at the long, capable fingers resting so casually against the denim of my jeans. It was an unconscious gesture, a simple accident of sleep. But to me, it felt like a confession. It felt like a question. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, my heart hammering against my ribs, unable to move, unable to breathe, until my own exhaustion finally claimed me, and I fell asleep sitting up, his hand still resting on my leg. That unconscious touch broke a barrier. After that night, the physical contact became more frequent, though always under the plausible deniability of sleep. He would shift closer, his shoulder pressing against mine, his leg brushing against my own. He was like a plant instinctively turning towards the sun, seeking warmth and light without conscious thought. And I, in my quiet, patient way, allowed it. I was the sun. I was the steady warmth he was seeking. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. I was playing with fire. I knew that. I was allowing a fragile hope to take root in the barren soil of my heart, a hope that could be easily crushed by a single word or a sudden realization on his part. But the comfort of his presence, the simple, profound rightness of having him near me, was a drug I couldn't bring myself to renounce. The true turning point, the moment that led us to that night from the beginning of this story, came about a month into this strange new ritual. He had just lost a major consulting client, a huge blow to his professional confidence and his finances. He was stressed and despondent, pacing the apartment like a caged animal. He didn't want to talk about it. He just radiated a tense, frantic energy that was painful to be around. That night, when he came to the couch, he was more restless than I had ever seen him. He couldn't get comfortable. He tossed and turned, sighing in frustration. After about 20 minutes of this, he sat up, running his hands through his hair in a gesture of pure exasperation. "I can't shut my brain off," he said, his voice tight with anxiety. I put my book down. "I'm sorry," I said softly. He looked at me, his eyes dark and troubled in the dim light. There was a long, heavy silence. And then, he did something that completely shattered the unspoken rules of our arrangement. He moved towards me, not unconsciously in his sleep, but with a clear, deliberate purpose. He curled up on his side, his back to the arm of the couch, and laid his head in my lap. Just like that. He didn't ask. He just did it. My entire world tilted on its axis. I could feel the heat of his cheek through the thin fabric of my sweatpants. I could feel the soft tickle of his hair against my stomach. My hands were frozen in midair, hovering uselessly over him. What was I supposed to do? Should I touch him? Should I push him away? My mind was a screaming chaos of conflicting impulses. He must have sensed my paralysis, because he reached up and took one of my hands, pulling it down to rest on his shoulder. "Just for a minute," he whispered, his voice thick with a weariness that seemed to go all the way to his bones. My fingers instinctively curled around his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him beneath my palm. And just like that, the chaos in my mind quieted. A profound, overwhelming sense of peace settled over me. It was as if a piece of my soul that I hadn't even realized was missing had just clicked into place. This was where he was supposed to be. This was where I was supposed to be. Holding him, comforting him. It was the most natural thing in the world. He fell asleep within minutes, his breathing finally evening out, the tension draining from his body. And I sat there, a living statue in the blue glow of the television, afraid to move, afraid to breathe, afraid to do anything that might shatter the fragile perfection of the moment. I watched the rise and fall of his chest. I studied the way his eyelashes cast long shadows on his cheeks. I committed every detail to memory, branding it onto my heart, because I was sure this was a moment that would never come again. A fluke, a beautiful, painful anomaly. This was the moment that I described, the one where I knew, with a terrifying certainty, that something had to break. We couldn't continue like this, living in this liminal space between friendship and something more. The silence between us had become too loud, filled with the deafening roar of everything we weren't saying. The weight of his head in my lap was more than just a physical presence. It was the weight of our shared history, of my secret love, of his unspoken need. It was the weight of the future, and I knew, with a sense of both dread and hope, that we were about to find out if we could bear it together. The weeks that followed that night were a study in suspended animation. The act of him resting his head in my lap became part of the ritual, a new, more intimate step in our nightly dance of ambiguity. It was no longer a desperate, one-time gesture, but an expected comfort. He would settle onto the couch, and after a few moments of feigned interest in whatever was on television, he would shift, look at me with a silent, questioning gaze, and I would nod, a barely perceptible motion that was all the permission he needed. He would then lay his head down, and a collective sigh of relief would seem to pass through the room, as if the space itself had been holding its breath. I would rest my hand on his shoulder or in his hair, my fingers gently tracing patterns on his scalp, and we would exist like that for hours, wrapped in a silence that was both profoundly comforting and agonizingly tense. My life became bifurcated. There was the daytime Leo, the professional photographer who navigated the city, interacted with clients, and maintained the facade of a normal, well-adjusted adult. And then there was the nighttime Leo, the keeper of a fragile, secret world, a man whose entire existence seemed to shrink to the dimensions of a worn, gray sectional couch. My thoughts were consumed by him, by us. I replayed every moment, every touch, every shared glance, searching for clues, for some definitive proof that I wasn't just imagining all of this. I was a detective investigating the mystery of my own life, and the primary suspect was my own hopeful, treacherous heart. I felt like I was living inside one of my own photographs, a long-exposure shot where the world was a blur of motion, but the two of us were a single, still point in the center of the frame, our outlines soft and bleeding into one another. I knew this state of equilibrium was unsustainable. It was a beautiful, delicate bubble, and I was terrified of the pinprick that would inevitably burst it. What would happen when he felt better? When he got over Sarah, when his work stabilized, when he no longer needed this crutch, this strange, nocturnal comfort I provided? Would he simply get up from the couch one night, dust himself off, and walk back into his own room, closing the door on this chapter of our lives? The thought was a cold knot of dread in my stomach. I had allowed myself to become essential to his healing, but I had no idea what would happen to me once he was whole again. I was becoming addicted to this proximity, to the quiet intimacy we had built, and I knew the withdrawal would be devastating. The breaking point arrived on a Tuesday. It was an unremarkable day, which seemed fitting. The most significant moments are rarely announced with trumpets. It had been raining all afternoon, a steady, gray drizzle that blurred the edges of the city and filled the apartment with a soft, melancholic light. Alex had been quiet all day, even more so than usual. He had a deadline for a massive project, and the stress was rolling off him in palpable waves. He barely ate, just nursed a single cup of coffee for hours, his face illuminated by the glow of his laptop screen. When evening came, he shut his computer with a sigh of deep, bone-weary exhaustion. He bypassed his own room and came directly to the couch, sinking into the cushions with a groan. He didn't even wait for my nod. He just laid his head in my lap, his eyes already closed. I placed my hand in his hair, the gesture now as familiar and automatic as breathing. We stayed like that for a long time, the only sounds the patter of rain against the window pane and the distant hum of traffic. The movie I had put on played to an audience of one, its dialogue and soundtrack a meaningless backdrop to the silent drama unfolding on the couch. The tension in the room felt different tonight. It was thicker, heavier, like the air before a thunderstorm. I could feel a nervous energy thrumming through Alex, a restlessness that even his exhaustion couldn't quite suppress. He shifted, his body adjusting, and then he was still again. My thumb stroked his temple, a slow, rhythmic motion meant to soothe both him and myself. The credits of the movie began to roll, and the living room was plunged into a deeper darkness, the only light now coming from the street lamps outside, casting long, distorted shadows across the floor. The silence that descended was absolute. It wasn't the comfortable silence we had grown accustomed to. It was a taut, charged silence, humming with unspoken energy. I felt my own heart rate begin to quicken. Something was about to happen. I could feel it in the air, in the sudden stillness of his body, in the way my own skin prickled with anticipation. Leo. His voice was a whisper, so quiet I almost thought I had imagined it. It was the first word either of us had spoken in over 2 hours. It seemed to hang in the air, fragile and heavy. My throat was tight. I had to clear it before I could answer. Yeah. My own voice sounded strained, foreign to my own ears. He didn't move, didn't open his eyes. He just lay there, his head a warm, solid weight in my lap. After another long, agonizing pause, he spoke again. Is this okay? The question was so simple, yet it contained a universe of meaning. He wasn't just asking about this specific moment. He was asking about all of it. About the weeks of sleeping on the couch, about the shrinking space between us, about the unspoken rules and the blurred boundaries. He was holding up the fragile bubble we had built and asking me to acknowledge its existence. My answer, I knew, would be the pin. I looked down at the top of his head, at the whirl of his blonde hair, and a wave of profound, aching affection washed over me, so strong it almost stole my breath. It swamped the fear, the anxiety, the years of carefully constructed self-preservation. In that moment, the only thing that mattered was the truth. It's okay, I said, my voice soft but clear, imbued with a certainty that surprised me. It was more than okay. It was everything. He let out a breath, a slow, shaky exhalation, as if he had been holding it for a very long time. He shifted then, pushing himself up slightly on one elbow so he could look at me. His face was only inches from mine. In the dim, shadowy light, I could just make out the expression in his eyes. It was a mixture of fear and hope and a deep, soul-shaking vulnerability. It was the same look he had given me in my dorm room all those years ago, the look that had first unlocked my heart. He licked his lips, a small, nervous gesture. Would it be okay, he began, his voice barely audible, a fragile thread of sound in the quiet room, if I tried something? Time seemed to slow down, to stretch and warp. The world narrowed to the space between our faces. The sound of the rain, the hum of the city, my own frantic heartbeat. It all faded into a distant, muffled roar. There was only his question, hanging between us like a suspended cord, waiting for resolution. He wasn't taking. He was asking. He was offering me a choice, giving me all the power. He was laying his own fragile, confused heart at my feet and trusting me not to crush it. I didn't trust my voice to work, so I just nodded. A single, slow, deliberate dip of my chin. It was all the answer he needed. He leaned in, closing the small distance between us. His movements were hesitant, uncertain, as if he was navigating uncharted territory in the dark. His lips met mine, and it wasn't a kiss of passion or demand. It was a question. It was a whisper. It was featherlight, soft, and unbelievably tender. It was the taste of rain and coffee and a loneliness so profound it had taken him years to find its way home. I closed my eyes, and my hand, which had been resting in his hair, slid down to cup the back of his neck, my thumb stroking the warm skin there. I kissed him back with all the unspoken yearning of the past 6 years, with all the quiet patience and the aching love I had kept locked away for so long. The kiss lasted for only a few seconds, but it felt like a lifetime. When he pulled back, he didn't go far. He rested his forehead against mine, and his eyes were still closed. We just stayed like that, breathing the same air, our heartbeats a frantic, unsynchronized rhythm in the quiet room. The bubble had burst. The silence had been broken. And in the wreckage, something new and terrifying and beautiful was beginning to take shape. I had no idea what would happen next, but in that moment, with the ghost of his kiss still on my lips and his forehead pressed against mine, I felt a sense of peace that was deeper and more profound than any I had ever known. We had crossed a line, and for the first time in a very long time, I wasn't afraid of what lay on the other side. The peace, however, was as fragile and fleeting as morning mist. The aftermath of the kiss was not a gentle dawn, but a sudden, jarring plunge into a cold and unfamiliar silence. When I woke up the next morning on the couch, I was alone. The blanket was folded neatly on the cushions, and the apartment was unnervingly still. A sliver of dread, cold and sharp, lodged itself beneath my ribs. I got up and walked to his bedroom door. It was closed. It hadn't been closed in months. It was a solid, wooden declaration of a boundary re-erected, a line drawn in the sand. My phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. A text from him. Had to get to work early. Big presentation. See you tonight. The words were mundane, practical, but the subtext screamed at me. The clipped, impersonal tone was a deliberate retreat. There was no mention of the night before, no acknowledgement of the seismic shift that had occurred between us. It was a clumsy, panicked attempt to stuff the truth back into the box, to pretend the line had never been crossed. I spent the day in a fog of anxiety, my mind replaying the kiss over and over again, analyzing it from every angle. Had I imagined the tenderness? Had I misinterpreted his vulnerability as something more? Maybe for him, it had just been a moment of weakness, a desperate grasp for comfort that he now regretted in the harsh light of day. The thought made me feel physically ill. I felt like a fool, like a man who had built a castle on a foundation of sand, only to be surprised when the tide came in. When he came home that evening, the tension in the apartment was thick enough to cut with a knife. He avoided my eyes, offering a tight, forced smile as he breezed past me towards his room. "Hey," he mumbled, his gaze fixed on some point on the wall just over my shoulder. And then he was gone, the click of his bedroom door shutting behind him as final and absolute as a gunshot. The silence he left in his wake was a new kind of silence. It wasn't the comfortable, shared quiet of our evenings on the couch. It was a weapon. It was an absence, a void, a painful, gaping hole where our easy camaraderie used to be. This went on for 3 days. 3 days of stilted, one-word conversations in the kitchen. 3 days of him avoiding the living room entirely, of the couch sitting empty and cold, a monument to a brief, beautiful era that was now over. He would come home, grab something to eat, and retreat to his room, the closed door a constant, painful reminder of the new distance between us. I was heartbroken. The pain was twofold. I was mourning the loss of a potential future I had just barely allowed myself to hope for. But more acutely, I was mourning the loss of my friend. The easy, comfortable foundation of our friendship had been shattered, and I didn't know if it could ever be repaired. The quiet observer in me had finally become a participant, and in doing so, I felt I had ruined everything. By the third night, I couldn't take it anymore. The anxiety and uncertainty were eating me alive. I would rather face a painful truth than continue to live in this agonizing limbo. I had to know. I had to understand. I waited until I heard him in the kitchen, the familiar clink of a glass telling me he was getting a late-night drink of water. I took a deep breath, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs, and went to face him. He was standing by the sink, his back to me, staring out the small window into the dark alley behind our building. He was wearing an old, faded t-shirt and boxer shorts, his shoulders slumped in a posture of utter defeat. He looked exhausted. I stood in the doorway, my arms crossed over my chest, a defensive posture I wasn't even aware of assuming. "Alex," he flinched, his whole body tensing at the sound of my voice. He didn't turn around. "Hey," he said, his voice low and rough. "We have to talk about this," I said, my voice quiet but firm, leaving no room for argument. "You can't just pretend it didn't happen. I can't live like this." He finally turned to face me. His face was pale, his eyes shadowed with a mixture of guilt and confusion. "I know," he whispered. "I'm sorry, Leo. I've been an asshole. I don't care about that," I said, taking a step into the room. "I just need to understand. What was that the other night? For you?" The question hung in the air, raw and vulnerable. I felt completely exposed, as if I had just torn open my own chest to show him my still beating heart. He leaned back against the counter, running a hand over his face. He looked like a man being asked to solve an impossible equation. "I don't know," he said, and the words were a punch to the gut. That's the honest truth. "I don't know." A cold, bitter wave of disappointment washed over me. "You don't know?" I repeated, my voice rising with a frustration I couldn't contain. "You kiss me like that, and you don't know what it meant." "No, that's not what I mean." he stammered, his eyes pleading with me to understand. He took a deep breath, struggling to find the words. For the past few months, since Sarah left, I've been so lost, so lonely. And being with you, on the couch, it was the only time I felt safe. The only time my brain would shut up. It was the only thing that felt real. He paused, looking down at his bare feet on the cool linoleum floor. And that night, it just felt right. Kissing you felt right. It felt more right than anything has in a very long time. He looked up at me, his eyes shining with unshed tears. And that scares the hell out of me, Leo. Because I don't know what that makes me. I've been with women my whole life. I'm supposed to be the guy who gets married, moves to the suburbs, has 2.5 kids. That's the life I'm supposed to want. But the thought of it makes me feel like I'm suffocating. And being with you, it feels like I can finally breathe. His confession was a torrent, a clumsy, desperate outpouring of all the fear and confusion he had been bottling up. He wasn't rejecting me. He was terrified of what accepting me, of what accepting these feelings meant for his own identity. He was afraid he had not only ruined our friendship, but also broken his own life, shattering the image of the man he was always supposed to be. I freaked out, he continued, his voice cracking. I woke up the next morning and all I could think was, what have I done? I thought I'd ruined the most important thing in my life. Our friendship. You. I didn't know how to face you. So I ran. It's what I do, all the anger and hurt drained out of me, replaced by a wave of overwhelming empathy. He wasn't a coward. He was just lost. He was standing at a crossroads he never even knew existed, and he was terrified of choosing the wrong path. I closed the distance between us, stopping just a foot away from him. You haven't ruined anything, I said softly. Look at me, Alex. He slowly lifted his gaze to meet mine. You haven't ruined anything, I repeated, my voice full of a conviction I suddenly felt deep in my bones. You're just figuring things out. And that's okay. You don't have to have all the answers right now. You don't have to label it. You don't have to know what it makes you. I took another step, and then another, until I was standing directly in front of him. I reached out and gently took his hand, his fingers cool against my own. All you have to do is not run away. Not from this. Not from me. A single tear escaped his eye and tracked down his cheek. He didn't wipe it away. He just squeezed my hand, a silent acknowledgement of my words. I don't know what I am, Leo, he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. I just know. I feel right. When I'm with you, that's enough, I said. For now, that's more than enough. And in the quiet, sterile light of our kitchen, surrounded by the ghosts of our old friendship and the terrifying promise of something new, we began to build a new foundation. Not on the shifting sands of ambiguity and unspoken needs, but on the solid ground of a clumsy, frightening, beautiful honesty. The conversation in the kitchen was not a magic wand. It didn't instantly resolve all of Alex's fears or erase my own insecurities. But it was a turning point. It was the moment we stopped allowing the silence to speak for us and started using our own voices, however hesitant and uncertain they were. It was the beginning of a new kind of quiet, one that was not filled with tension and unspoken questions, but with a nascent, growing understanding. We started over, not as friends and not quite as lovers, but as two people carefully, gently learning a new language together. The couch was abandoned. It felt like a relic of a past era, a space freighted with too much history, too much ambiguity. The first night after our talk, as we were cleaning up after dinner, an awkward, uncertain silence fell. The old routine was broken, and we didn't have a new one to replace it. Alex stood by his bedroom door, his hand on the knob, a look of indecision on his face. I saw the old impulse to retreat warring with the new promise he had made not to run. I made the first move. Are you going to bed? I asked, my tone deliberately casual. He nodded, not meeting my eyes. Yeah. Long day, okay, I said. I turned to go to my own room, my heart sinking a little. Maybe things weren't going to change after all. But then his voice stopped me. Leo. I turned back. He was still standing there, his hand on the doorknob, looking at me with that familiar, vulnerable expression. Would you want to watch a movie? In here. He gestured vaguely with his head towards his room. The invitation was a peace offering. It was a conscious, deliberate choice to create a new space for us, one that was not defined by accident or plausible deniability. It was an act of intention. A small smile touched my lips. Yeah, I said. I'd like that. His room was different from how I remembered it. The traces of Sarah were gone, replaced by stacks of books and Alex's own, slightly chaotic clutter. It felt more like him. We sat on his bed, propped up against a mountain of pillows, and watched some mindless action movie on his laptop. There was a careful foot of space between us, a buffer zone of mutual uncertainty. But as the movie wore on, I felt him begin to relax. His shoulder brushed against mine. He didn't pull away. Halfway through the film, I felt his fingers tentatively intertwine with my own. I squeezed his hand, and he squeezed back. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. The simple, solid warmth of his hand in mine said everything. That night, for the first time, we slept in the same bed. It was chaste, almost childlike. We lay on our backs, side by side, our hands still linked between us on the mattress. There was no kissing, no desperate fumbling. There was just the profound, peaceful comfort of presence. It was the intimacy of shared breath in a dark room, of knowing that the person you cared for most in the world was lying just inches away, and that he had chosen to be there. For the first time in months, I slept without the knot of anxiety in my stomach. I slept deeply and dreamlessly, anchored by the weight of his hand in mine. Our new normal was built on 1,000 such small, quiet moments. It was in the way he started making me coffee in the morning, remembering exactly how I liked it. It was in the way I'd find him looking at me from across the room with a soft, wondering expression on his face. It was in the casual, easy touches that were no longer accidental. A hand on the small of my back as I passed him in the hallway, his arm slung around my shoulders as we sat on the porch, his head resting on my shoulder, not in my lap, as we watched TV. The dynamic had shifted from a desperate, one-sided comfort-seeking to a mutual, gentle care. He talked. He opened up to me about his fears, his confusion about his identity, his relief at finally being able to be honest with someone. I listened, and I shared my own story, the long, lonely years of loving him in secret, the fear of losing him. We were like two archaeologists, carefully brushing the dust off the delicate, buried artifacts of our own hearts and showing them to each other. The process was slow, sometimes painful, but it was also incredibly healing. We were building a new kind of trust, one that was stronger and more resilient than the one we'd had before, because it was forged in the fire of total vulnerability. One Saturday afternoon, about a month into our new beginning, I was in my makeshift darkroom, a converted bathroom, developing a set of black and white prints. The red safe light cast an eerie, beautiful glow over everything. I was so absorbed in my work, watching an image of a rain-slicked street slowly emerge in the chemical bath, that I didn't hear him come in. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice a soft intrusion in the quiet, sacred space. I looked up, surprised. "Hey, just working." He came to stand beside me, peering into the tray. "It's like magic," he said, his voice full of awe. "Watching something appear out of nowhere, it's not nowhere," I explained, gently agitating the tray. "The image is already there, latent in the paper. You just have to have the right chemistry, the right conditions, to bring it out into the light." He was quiet for a moment, watching the image resolve into sharp, clear focus. Then he looked at me, and in the strange, crimson light, his eyes were incredibly clear. "I think I know how that feels," he said softly. He leaned in and kissed me then. It was different from our first kiss on the couch. There was no hesitation, no fear. It was a kiss of quiet confidence, of a truth that had been brought out into the light and found to be beautiful. It was a kiss that tasted like home. We had found our rhythm. The journey wasn't over. In many ways, it was just beginning. There were still conversations to be had, a world outside our apartment to navigate, but the foundation was solid. The loudest silences, I've learned, are the ones filled with unspoken truths, with the fears and desires we are too afraid to name. For years, Alex and I had lived in that silence, orbiting each other in a state of suspended animation. But finding the courage to speak, to ask the terrifying questions, to confess the fragile truths that didn't break us. It didn't shatter the sanctuary of our friendship. It transformed it. It expanded its walls, knocked down the unnecessary partitions, and built something new in its place, something stronger and more honest. We began to heal in the beautiful, honest silence we had learned to create together, a quiet space filled not with yearning, but with the peaceful, certain rhythm of two hearts finally beating in time.